Okay, let's get going. I'm still working on defining use cases, but I promised we'd get on the notion of abstraction and pattern and classes. And I'm, as I said, still working on this. I've spoken about the set theoretic basis of predicates and claims, saying something is included in another. And I think a lot of arguments end up being about inclusion and exclusion. So what you have is you define a pattern. You say, this is the name I want to give to a class of instances. Now, class instance is a relational property. Something is an instance of a class, but an instance could be a class of something else, and the class could be an instance of something else. It's not a status. But I think it's fundamental. You define a class of things, and you may or may not have predicates to back it up. We said, oh, it may be the same as predicates. I don't know, Stephen, would you hear me? We said we might say classes are the same as predicates. And now I'm thinking, actually, it is valid sometimes to introduce a class before you have the predicates to back it up. Sorry, I must put this on pause. Okay, so, I think this and that, and this is what I call introduce a pattern through examples. I think this and this and this individual belong to a class that's relevant to a claim. I want to name that class. I don't know what are the common properties yet, but I think it's valid for me to introduce the class before I have predicates to define it. Maybe the definition is exhaustive, maybe it's just examples, that shouldn't matter. The other operation is to say, well, here are the predicates that define this class. And then basically you have a hypothesis saying, I think these bunch of examples correspond to those that are defined by those predicates. Or you can take an intentional definition, one with predicates, and say, well, I think this is equivalent to that. Maybe I should distinguish those two cases. But the idea that, if I defined a class by examples, I probably have a predicate in head, even though it's not articulated yet. It's the whole progressive formalization. I mean, I want to be able to name something without I can define it. And then I'm arguing a lot of arguments take the form of saying, well, this is an example, this is a valid example, this is a valid counterexample, this instance belongs to that predicate, this instance does not belong to that predicate. If you don't have a predicate yet, you are arguing a bit more vaguely, but what will happen when you say, I've got a proto class built of examples, and this example also belongs there, you'll be arguing with predicates most of the time, even though the predicates have not yet been formalized in a definition. So that's empirical argument, saying this case belongs, this case does not belong. There's theoretical inclusion, saying, well, I think all cases of this predicate, anything that satisfies this predicate also satisfies that predicate. And this is vague. I mean, because it's probably, sometimes it can be outside of pure logic, right? It's a theoretical fact. It's based on some theory. It's based on some something else other than logic. Now, sometimes also when it's a formula, if you have extra logical facts to justify predicate inclusion, then that can give you logical rules to say that this compound predicate is included in this other compound predicate if you have things about the individual predicates. But in general, this is, you're saying this is part of that, and that's an argument. Theoretical challenge, this is kind of non-empirical exception. You're saying, well, I think this could fit there and not there. I don't have a actual case, I have a theoretical case. That's kind of in non-intuitionistic mathematics. This is what we do. That's a fairly rare case, I think. And I was trying to define what fits in theoretical justification of challenge. I think all these might be most cases. I was looking at syllogism cases, when you say argue between universals, all x are y, all y are z, hence all x are z. I think a lot of them are about theoretical inclusion and the transitivity thereof. And a lot of arguments about is this valid or non-valid, like is this relevant, is this not relevant? Well, often it's about, can we derive belonging, being part of that predicate class from belonging in that other predicate class, which is the theoretical inclusion, or it's about establishing a distinction and saying actually those two are using the same term, or maybe not even using the same term, but there's overlap, but actually there are distinct cases that fall outside the overlap. So you're, again, in a way doing, you're doing a pattern, empirical distinction here between two classes, partition. And then we get into totally distinct things of, comparison that's about this is more than that according to some common predicate with a literal value, literal term. Taller than this, better than this, and so on. Causal account, hypothetical scenarios. I think they all fall under, I don't know, again, hypothetical event corresponding to a prior and a pattern. It's, again, the same thing. I think a lot of these more concrete cases fall under these general building blocks. The one that doesn't is simile. That one is, I'm still not banging my head, but I'm still, I find it fascinating, the notion of simile, because you're arguing from two things fitting a pattern to extending the pattern, but it's still all pattern matching. I mean, basically, I realized that a lot of argument is trying to define a pattern between individuals and saying, does this fit, does this not fit the pattern, and what's the relationship between the patterns? Can this pattern imply this pattern? So do you see any holes in that description, is my question to you all.
By holes, you mean whether it's exhaustive or?
Yeah. Do you see grand categories of arguments that cannot be reduced to this notion of, we have classes defined by predicates or by example, and then we argue this predicate is included in this one, strictly or not, and this instance is included in the members of that predicate?
My intuition says yes, there must be gaps here.
Yeah, it's hard. It's I'm not convinced I'm being exhaustive, but right now I'm finding it hard to find other cases.
Yeah, but you haven't even found examples to match these.
No, I know.
It's a bit unfair to ask for us to give examples of things that this doesn't match if there's no examples of things it does match.
That's,
I mean,
perfect.
it greatly enhances the thinking process if you would do that.
That's perfectly legit. So what I've been thinking is I should, in a way, this is kind of the use case at another level, right? I'm trying to do my use case list, but it's at a more fundamental level than the argument and claim use case list we've been doing. So yeah, absolutely. I have to do the homework of doing examples.
It sounds like you're doing, you're asking for a sanity check to say, is this the 80 of the 80-20, and does it seem like a good direction? And I think the silence is kind of a confirmation of both of those.
Yes, it is a sanity check, but it's true. I mean, the point that I still have to do my homework and give examples is perfectly well taken. But yes, is there something?
There doesn't seem to be any obvious holes that I can see.
Okay. Let me start to give examples because that's fair. I propose we do this. What I should be doing also is try to model that, but I wanted to have more the mental model first. What I was also trying to think is how would I challenge it with them, but that's later. Oops. Oh. Let me first start with intention. Well, actually, this is an example here of that one. Well, the first sentence, really. This is an example of we are defining a pattern using predicates. What's this?
Can you do the decomposition?
Mm-hmm.
What's the pattern? What's the predicate?
Okay, this is my attempted analysis. I have an entity which is species. Right now it could be defined, but I'm leaving it undefined. I'm defining a predicate which is populated. There's the species is populated at a certain time, in a certain geographic range with defaults. If there's some individual which is alive in that, which is a member of that species. Mass extinction. We've got a species which was populated that it's an event. Event has a start time and an end time. And the species was populated at the start and not at the end. So that's an informal definition of mass extinction. There's at least 2 species. And here's a more formal definition. We're saying, it's a refinement of the informal one. We're saying the number of things that are species is here in that extinction, those species of the extinction, the parameter of the extinction is more than half of the all species that one is the species definition in general. And duration less than, that's a constraint on the duration. I don't pretend that this is a complete formal language yet. I'm working towards it, but I was trying to. And there's a further claim that there's exactly 5 of those that fit those parameters, and that those, and else later in the text there was, here are the 5 they're named. So here's an exhaustive list of examples.
It's actually interesting because what you start with is not even a claim, right? Here are the five. I mean, it's not a claim. It's a. I guess the claim would be there are five.
Yeah. These are the so-called, and this is interesting, absolutely, because in terms of, it's not clear what is the theme and what is the ream here. What is the, I'm introducing this definition. Is that the theme or the ream? Is that, I think it's the ream in this case. But these, like,
it's an indexical reference, so you need to know what is written above to understand what's going on.
There's these lists, there's these 5 examples. So this is interesting because he first starts with 5 examples. Here's 5 individual extinction events. And those, they're called the big 5. And that's a name for the class. And again, that's a intuitive class. So that's very much what I use. There's a intuitive informal class defined through examples. But in this case, it's claimed to be exhaustive because we are defining formally mass extinction to have this and this and this defining predicates. And so, and there's a claim that only those 5 specific mass examples, not just any 5, are the ones that fit that definition. And that is probably a claim.
Yeah, so what's interesting about this is that there is the definition here you've made of what is a mass extinction event, right?
Yeah.
So you've created a definition that is, in this case, formulaic, and then you can have debates about, but you can have debates about, whether or not X event or X moment in time was a mass extinction event, and use this definition for your basis of that debate. But you could also say that, in another debate, you can say, mankind is not causing a mass. Yeah, but you could say, mankind is not causing a mass extinction event now. And your argument is because all 5 mass extinction events were all caused by asteroids crashing into the Earth.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. Which
now, so essentially what you've got there is all 5 mass extinctions is your thing that needs to be defined, and it wouldn't use this formula. It's a thing that is actually, you're not referring to the concept of mass extinction. You're referring to someone has declared somewhere that these moments in time were 5 masses. So you're referring to something else. You're referring to a set of time that somebody else has already determined were mass extinctions, and you're referring to that collection. If there's other mass extinctions that are discovered later, it doesn't change your argument. It might change the relevance of your argument because, you were saying every mass extinction is caused by asteroids, and now we found one that was caused by carbon dioxide or something, right?
By massive eruptions. Actually, only one is established.
No, I made that up.
It's a good argument for that reason, right? It's a good case for that reason. We get to our, but here, what we're doing is we have a local, and I do agree totally with you. This is a local definition of mass extinction. This person writing this book defined mass extinction this way. Someone else in another argument defines it in a different way. It's a mass extinction. Maybe they'll share the more than half of Earth species, but they'll say, and furthermore, it has to be caused by an asteroid impact. So that's an alternative definition. And the alternative definition may be using the same term, but it's a different concept because it's using different predicates. And the whole question is, and this is, let's riff on that example, it's basically making a claim that those 2 definitions with different sets of predicate are equivalent. I'm making, like, the person making that claim is saying whether or not we define it by asteroids or not, they're equivalent because guess what? They're always there's full overlap between those definitions. And somebody else is saying, well, nope, sorry, pattern distinction or pattern mismatching. There's this one that fits one definition and not the other, so the definitions are not equivalent. So we have to know which definition we're using for which set of predicates corresponds to the concept in a given argument using the words mass extinction. Do you mean this one or this one?
Okay, but what is the structure of, because these are the so-called big five mass extinctions, is a definition, right? So then you could use the so-called big five mass extinctions in other debates. And in that case, what is that definition of the so-called big five mass extinctions made of? What are the elements of that definition?
Actually, I would say the big five mass extinction is described, it's interesting because on the one hand, it's defined by extension. It's defined, it's this one, this one, this one, this one, 5 events, that's it. And we gave a name to that list. And on the other hand, we're saying it happens to match that predicate definition. Look, if you take any mass extinction event, blah, 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 well, you'll end up with those same big five. And that's the current state of knowledge. And maybe, as you say, someday we'll discover, well, actually that other extinction event qualifies. So we should speak of the big six really, or the old big five list, which probably wouldn't be changed because it was defined by extension, is not as interesting as the big six list because now we've decided that what's important is the definition. And since this other extinction event falls in the definition, we're now speaking about the big six list, which is more important than the big five list, but it doesn't stop the big five list from existing, right? So you have two concepts and there's the assertion that they match, that right now, current state of knowledge, this list of 5 events and this definition are the same. I don't know if that answers your question though.
It answers and brings up more questions because I'm trying to think about, you know, how to manage all these. First of all, what is the definition made of? If it's by extension, as you've said, which would be one common way to do that, what are the elements of that definition? If it's like text, for example, you know, do changes in text fork the definition, or does it create different definitions, or can the text be improved? These are, yeah, there's a lot of questions here that we would need to go through.
No, it's absolutely valid. I mean, and I agree, there's tons of questions. Okay, so for me, entities are a model object. And as I said, entities can be in the class instance relationship. So in this case, we have an instance representing each of the 5, an entity representing each of the 5 mass extinctions. And we have a class saying this class is a name we give to this list of 5 instances. So a collection is, for me, another entity, the named entity. And yeah, I can see, for example, people arguing, for example, let's take the great, let's take the great, which one is one of the greatest extinction? Not the dinosaur, the other one, the really horrible extinction where the trilobites finally lost it. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Let's take the dinosaur extinction. It's easier. The dinosaur extinction, people could argue about its boundaries. Did it last so many? Was it over so many years? Over so many years? Over so many years? And so we have conflicting definitions of what this entity is. And yet in all those definitions, we're still talking about the same event and there's no argument that it fits in the big 5, which is interesting. There's this notion that we can call it many things and we can even define it many ways, but it's still the same event. And it's still for the purpose of the list of mass extinctions, all those definitions refer to the same entity for the purpose of that definition, even though they can be shown to be distinct. In this case, it's over, a million years, 500,000 years, whatever, right? But yeah, for me, entities are first-class objects, and predicate is a first-class object, and the relationship and predicates define classes. So classes can be defined either through predicate formula or lists of entities. And the match between those is what's at stake in this case. And that's why I think it's an interesting case. But in general, I think a lot of arguments are about match between classes. When we say, does this belonging to this class entail belonging to that class, we're saying sometimes it's an argument at the predicate level, sometimes it's at the instance level. I have this instance that belongs here and not there, so they cannot be contained. That's empirical argument. Sometimes it's a theoretical empirical instance argument. I could imagine this thing that fits here and not there.
General question.
Yep.
Is why aren't instances predicates?
A valid question. They can be, but I think they have to be. Okay, I did say instance is relational, it's not a status. Maybe it's possible, I've no fundamental objection, but I would mark separately predicates that have a unique, that are meant to have a unique instance satisfying them. There exists a unique X such that. For me, those are different from there are many X's such that. And sometimes you have, and that's a quote unquote intentional definition. Like sometimes you have a predicate that's meant to define a class, but it just so happens there's a unique instance, but there couldn't be two in theory. It's just, that's a different kind than the ones that are intended to single out an individual. So, but I have no objection otherwise to instances, entities being defined through predicates.
Great, so it's just a convenience in the notation, basically.
So then you had questions about what are the instances? Are they text? Did that answer that question at least?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure these structures that you're proposing are complete, and that makes me really worried that the complexity of this exercise goes beyond what is practical. I think of the Wiki Media Foundation or other knowledge graph efforts that are large teams working endlessly to try to capture all this, and it seems pretty what's the term? I'm thinking another language. Don Quixote. What is it?
Quixotic. Quixotic is the adjective.
Quixotic. I couldn't remember English.
It's Quixotic, but yes.
Yeah.
It's written Quixotic.
I know it's Don Quixote, but it's Don Quixote. But whatever, it's Quixotic in English. Which makes me think of what would be another approach, right? And that might be, what would incremental formalization look like here? The simplest thing I can think of, and I don't know if that would work either, would be, a definition is just a block of text, right? and the block of text is an 80-20 thing. It'll get you through Kialo or something, right? But because here are the problems where it can come up. What if that block of text? Well, one problem is, what if it's just not well written, and you need to improve it? Okay. Another problem is, what happens if?
Can I just say one thing before you continue? I spend a lot of time trying to find the end-point of progressive formalization. That doesn't mean I don't support the intermediate
I understand.
steps.
And I'm not implying you're not supporting it.
It's unclear though how, because I tend to agree with, I would very much, I get you focusing on the endpoint, but I don't think by only focusing on the endpoint that by default you can do incremental formalization. It is required to, in order to do incremental formalization, that you can link back less formalized forms to more formalized forms, and it's unclear what those are.
Fair, that's not explicit in that direction, but I do think, okay, let's go through that. It's an important point.
Because that's basically what Timothy is asking, right? Like, what is the first informal thing that gets added by the user, and then you break that up in more formalized forms. But even here, it's a bit unclear how that will work.
Yeah, what's the in-betweens?
What's the in-betweens? And I agree with you that text is probably it, but what I think what's in between is, no matter what we do, we're trying to find out patterns. We're trying to find out, we've got a bunch of cases, but we're trying to think of them as a group in an argument. An argument is about, well, this case fits this pattern or doesn't fit this pattern, or this pattern fits this pattern. So we have to name the pattern. We have to say what we mean by this pattern, and that's the definition. And I'm perfectly fine with it being as a block of text to start with. And the question of inclusion can perfectly be asked about 2 blocks of text, right? So the operation is the same. And then we can say, well, if we want to be formal, let's have predicates. But and by the way, it is why I introduced examples, because for me, examples come before we even have a text definition. I have this vague thing in my head. I don't know what it is. I'm looking for this pattern. There's these 3-4 things here. I think they fit the pattern. I don't know what a pattern is. Let me just say, this is a group of stuff which I think belongs together, and name that thing before I even attempt a text definition. So that's even more progressive. But I agree, I should put the text definition as a kind of intermediate case in the formalization ladder. That's a fair point. But I think the question of, is this an example, is this a subset, are absolutely the same.
Yeah, I think also showing different stages of formalization. Like, for example, if we're talking about disambiguation, right now we're talking actually about the details of the elements of disambiguation, but forget that for a second. Assume that is done one way or another. We can intuit understand incremental formalization in terms of disambiguation, because you start with a claim with no disambiguation, and then maybe you disambiguate by disambiguating only one part of the claim. You disambiguate one, so you've kind of formalized the one part you needed to formalize at that point.
Absolutely.
Right? So it would be interesting to see the analogy here in this with this focus.
And thank you for that. That is important. You're right. I tend to think of formal, informal, and the question is, if you have formalized one part, and it's a case I had thought about, but not recently, and thanks for bringing that back to my attention. How to create a hybrid definition with some elements formal and some elements informal. That's a perfectly valid use case. I'm all for it.
Yeah, and there's also the question of to what extent is this useful? And I would say most of it isn't useful, except that I know that we've only scratched the surface of set theory with relation to claims and that sort of thing. And I know there's going to be some need for that. So you need to relate the relationship between definitions better. But yeah, that's just something we can explore in the future. I'm not saying right now. It's just.
I don't see how you don't see the usefulness of this, even to your need of canonicalization, honestly.
You can achieve canonicalization through curation. You don't need to formalize everything to create a canonical representation. So the question is, why do you need to sew that in order to obtain a canonical form?
Okay,
you need disambiguation, right? So you need a way to express every possible disambiguation. The question is, could you do that through text, or could you do that through referring to an external text? Would that suffice? And that might do it for canonicality.
And then it's not formalized, but if a user can disambiguate between pieces of text, exactly, you don't need to formalize more than that piece of text. That's indeed why it might be.
I mean, one point he's brought up though is, are two definitions the same? Because if you have two, if your definitions aren't, or disambiguations aren't canonical, then you could call a claim canonical, two separate claims different when they're actually the same, because they share different instantiations of the same definition, right?
Yeah, but again, in the end, whether or not two claims are the same or not is an evaluation done by a human. I think we had the same discussion some time ago.
Correct.
You can,
and so you could also just say these two definitions are the same. Yes, yeah.
The final judgment will always be a human. Otherwise, they're not really recognizing.
Well, more complicated than that. The final judgment will be all humans.
Yeah, exactly. It's
which is more complicated, but yeah. But so going back to the thought exercise I was trying to walk through. When are the points that you need to formalize the definition, or when it's dangerous to change a definition or to formalize it more, right? So it goes back to from the canonical debate use, when the question of there were 5 and now there are 6 extinction events, is it relevant to change your definition of, do you need to copy over the claims now that there's 6 extinction events instead of 5? Can you change the definition of 5 to just say 6 now and that solves it? Do you need to use a formula? And are there differences between using the formula? I mean, it all depends on the claims that are being used in, right? So the case of you had 5, now there are 6. Can you just tack one on, right? Well, the determination at that point would specifically be, well, let's look at all the claims that are using this definition and see if it no longer works. Same thing with the Satoshi Nakamoto example. It's like, well, now it's a group of people. Did that affect any of the claims out there? Okay, we kind of need to break off or something.
Yeah, and I think I agree there totally. The point is not to update the old claims, because the old claim was made with the old definition and remains existing in its own right, except we would have probably be alerted this has been, this is using an outdated definition, and we may create an updated claim and say this claim has been updated. Here's a new version if you want to see it, because the definition's been updated. And we'll, if the person, if we track persons, which I do, which I know you don't.
A new version, right?
Yeah.
Because there can be competing versions again. So
of course,
can't really say which one is the one that.
But what I was going to say is, if you track people, which I know you don't, but I do, you'll say we may or may not be able to contact whoever made that claim to know if they agree with the updated claim, which is but it's not necessary in general. The claim still exists. The original claim still exists and can still be held by somehow.
A claim doesn't belong to anyone, otherwise it's not canonical. Then you're just representing all claims that everyone makes. That's I would say the opposite of canonical.
Which is my goal and not yours. I started with that.
Yeah, but it's a major discrepancy in what canonical means, I think.
No, it's not. I want to store both. I want to both know claim as canonical claim and all the instances by specific people. They're distinct things. I want to store both, the canonical and the non-canonical, and the one with origin, the provenance claim.
Okay, then how is is a canonical claim then one that doesn't belong to anyone? If you say you want to store both.
Yes, it's the one. It's not that it doesn't belong, but it's been abstract. The origin's been abstracted. How did I call it? Decontextualized. Decontextualized claims.
Okay, so decontextualized claims is, I think, what we call canonical.
Yes. Yeah. There's contextualized and decontextualized, and I think both have their importance. And you don't, and that's fine. It's not the same.
No, I don't disagree. I'm just saying that if you're talking about decontextualized claims in your vocabulary, then you cannot ask the context what was intended.
Correct.
In that case,
correct.
There's multiple.
But in the case of a contextualized
meanings.
claim, it can make sense.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
But to go back to one of the things, okay, so we agree on that much, that's good. To go back to one of the things you were saying about how important is it to go beyond text for canonicality, because that's one of the questions, right? My argument remains that it's easier to notice cases, for example, where there's stupid variations, such as conjunction in different orders. So we need to canonize the order. With text, it's hard. If the text has been decomposed into components, actually, even if the components are still text, and there you have a point, it's interesting. It may be easier to compute, but it's true that there may be variation in the text expression, and then we lose the ability to compute. But still, if we can, the further we can go, transforming text into entities. I mean, the predicates are entities too, right? The predicates have their own ambiguity and disagreement, but it doesn't totally solve the problem either. But if we do the operation of saying, well, this text definition breaks up in these components, and we can start with breaking down the components as text, and then those text components correspond to those predicates, the further we go in that, the more it's easy to identify duplicates or to assist humans in identifying duplicates.
So I understand that. So indeed, it could be that this will become useful once there's so many duplicates in there that people can't easily find them, and then a way to find duplicates is formalizing claims further. But then again, if you only formalize particular claims, you're not going to be able to use those formalizations to find other duplicate claims. So if you presume that everything is fully formalized, which is a whole lot of work, then then your problem is solved. But okay. In any way,
that's an argument that I make against you a lot, and it's perfectly fair to make it to me. We can't always depend on the end state.
But so I understand that there's value in like it could be like a job to formalize things that are claims that are heavily used by a lot of people, to formalize them more, so that you can have more guidance on finding duplicates. That would be the main use case I can agree on. Yeah. But it's still text first.
I agree totally with that.
Yeah.
I agree it's text first. But I'm saying, for example, it is useful and relevant if there's a compound claim to decompose it, because it makes it's easier to identify identity of text fragments than of the compound statement, for example. And that's not a big step. You know, we can ask people to do it with a bloody point form. what is important, I think, is that, how should I put it? Getting people to think about classes as patterns, I think, is useful, because this is an intuition. Okay, I'm really grasping after something that is not fully defined, but we tend to think of classes as existing out there. They don't. They're a construction of the mind. Even natural kind like clades, right? There is a hard correlate, but it's still a construction of the mind. It's getting to think of classes as patterns and predicates, sure. Like, let's take animals. You can classify animals by clades or by biome or by trophic role, and they're all valid in certain contexts. These are all valid classifications in certain contexts. It makes it a bit easier for people, to come up with hypotheses. I'm vaguely thinking of this pattern and I don't know what it is yet. I think that's important when tentative classes are important, but also it helps people, I think, be less rigid about classification, in the sense, well, the pattern is constructed, this is how it's constructed. It could be constructed otherwise, and there can be border cases, and there can be, when you see how the pattern is constructed, you may be a bit more sensitive to the reality of border case. Like, I would even say, for example, when creating a proto class, we could have a slot for border cases. That's an example. Or we could, if it's well defined with predicates, we could even say, well, this is how these border cases fall according to this proposed rule. And that's useful. It gets people to understand the rule better, the definition better. This is how it treats corner cases. I think there's value in making that explicit, for like pedagogical value in making that explicit. That's what I'm trying to do here. Getting people to think about not everything falls into categories or into definitions, and the definitions are always negotiated.
This really reveals the complexity of reality.
That's the point.
Kind of,
Yes.
yeah.
And that's the other reason I want to push towards, in a way, more formalization. It's to show the arbitrariness of the formalized construct, and the fact that there's many concurrent formalizations.
I mean, I don't see why you need to formalize forms for that. The mere fact that you have competing definitions already does that as well, right?
True. But we have arguments of the form: are those two definitions equivalent? And where do they differ? Where do they not differ? Being able to say,
be honest, I mean, I know they exist, but I think it's a contrived example. I don't think most real-world argumentation is about whether or not two definitions are the same or not.
Have you been listening to the division about men and women recently?
About what?
Men and women.
What about men and women?
The whole argument is, are those real categories or are those constructed categories? And
yeah, but the arguments raised in that context are entirely different. If you look at actual reasons why people are bringing it up, the arguments are bringing them up has nothing to do with the definition. Well, it has, but if you would model that in an argument map, I don't think
it might be an interesting example, actually.
Yeah, I actually have a similar one on Socrates.
Oh, you've muted yourself.
I actually have a discussion on sex on Socrates. I broke up at some point.
Okay, that would be interesting to look at.
Gender is not the same as sex.
Can you link to it?
Gender is so, yeah, I'm just trying to find the root claim here.
And
Gen-
this is falls under the Bentley category of debating about definitions or
Yeah.
words. which
But
is-
yeah, I agree though, this is a good example, but if you look at the arguments that are being raised,
These at the top are comments, right?
sorry?
The culturally there are two genders. Is that
Those are comments, yeah, the arguments
Comments,
are
yeah.
the green things. Yeah, if
So
you
how
look
does-
at like the arguments that are being raised, they're not definition. Well, they are in a way. I guess saying gender is not the same as sex is a definition, but it's about society and culture, biology. What
Biologically, there are two
associate
genders. It's
as-
about equating the gender definition with the biological.
Yeah, and that's the main point in that discussion, for example. So it's not so much about mapping what male or female is. It's more about the surrounding discussion.
And there are discussions that go deep into the non-binarity, not only of the cultural gender, but of
if you
sex. And
dig into these arguments, they will be
what's
raised.
and what's a man, what's a woman?
Like click gender is not the same as sex, for example. You can see there's 4 underlying arguments.
But you know what strikes me, or what's interesting about this debate, because it maps well the messy things that go on in human discourse, right? It's not really fact-based. It's not a fact-based discussion. And what that means to me is that the claims being made here are not
so some things are
worthwhile.
fact-based.
They're not useful, or they're not the right claims. What do I mean by that? And that this is something I'm probing here in my concept on this here, right? What are you really trying to say by gender is not the same thing as sex? Because if you disambiguate that, you say, oh, gender is blah, 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 and sex is blah, blah, blah. Oh, look, there are different definitions. Correct, right? So that's not an interesting claim, right? From that perspective. But why are people saying those things? Well, they're trying to say something else, right? They're really trying to say either, I think that society should have only male and female on web forms because that, and then they would have to say because, well, that could be a claim, and then you have to say because and support it. Why do you really care about that? Is it because our lives would be more simple? Because I think people should conform to those certain expectations? Is it because something else? So in other words, those claims, first of all, they're what I call unresolvable, even though I don't have a definition for that. But it's like, really, why are you saying that? And what claims are you really trying to make here about society? What society should do with that information?
That's where you came from, right? That's
boys
why
should
I
dress
highlighted
like boys
this.
and girls should dress like girls, or what? Yeah.
But I mean, you can keep going up, but the reason why this got added was because it supports gender as a social construct. And then the question is, why do people say that? Well, people can say that. I don't think it got used anywhere else. This was starting point.
Well, okay,
Can be
but what is the
indeed,
definition of is a social construct, right?
Yeah. So you can go deeper and deeper, but the reason why people are saying that's going up in the other direction of the tree, right? Then you need to see why that is being used. I don't think it's being used anywhere right now. Let me see.
But
Yeah, but it's more like, what I would want to see in society's discussion about this is really we're using gender, the same word, and we're battling over what its definition should be, right? Because everybody agrees that there is a biological component to male and female. Not everybody is aware that the body itself, there are gradations and variations in that between genotype and phenotype, and so on and so forth. Those are interesting things. But when you just say gender is a social construct, or there's more than one gender, it's a battle over definitions. You say, no, here's my definition of gender. Here's your definition of gender, and
But what I'm saying is, when you said this is a fact-free conversation, I understand what you're saying, that often arguments are stand in for a non-spoken argument. There, I totally agree with you. But it's not that it's fact-free, right? When people say there are biological sexes other than male and female, that's a biological
Yeah,
fact,
but
right?
what I mean by that is the only relevant argument or the only relevant information to resolve a claim gender is not the same as sex is what is your definition of gender and what is your definition of sex. That in terms of fact-based, boom, I have the answer to, you know, I've solved that problem there. I know what's true or false. Then it's a question of, we're actually talking about different definitions for gender, and we're talking about different definitions of sex.
This is really interesting, because I love that example, and I actually will dig more into it because I think it's a very rich example. But when I say, you know, a lot of arguments are about, does this theoretical category, is this category included in that category on as a matter of principle, right? This is exactly what this is about. Is, can we say that we can derive gender from sex or not? And it's, the counterexamples are mostly empirical, and saying that there's things that escape the partition of humans into male and female, and there's instances that escape that those subsets, depending, of course, on definition of male and female, but certainly on genetic grounds. We're not all XY or XX. But it's the equivalence between categories is a fundamental construct, is a fundamental argumentative construct. And you're right that there's the notion of implied. Why do you mean that? It's because I don't want, we should not impose a binary gender based on a non-binary sex, right? That's kind of the argument here. Sex is not binary.
One of many, the whole point is that it can be set for many different reasons. And indeed, it can be definitional, it can be something else. It really depends on context, what people are trying to say with that.
True.
It's a decontextualized claim, and as a decontextualized claim, it can mean anything. So it really depends on the arguments you raise to see what people are trying to mean. That's why I map it like this. But indeed, if you start by defining things, then the whole arguments that underlie it will be a lot more meaningful, and it will be clear what the point is.
Yeah, because right now people are misunderstanding each other. Sorry, Marc-Antoine.
No. You're absolutely right. We had spoken about implicit arguments a lot. Like, this argument has this implicit hypothesis or this implicit defeater. And here, what you're raising, and I think it's an important point, is that the implicit intent, it's not so much an implicit presupposition, but an implicit goal, which is dependent of what you're trying to, of an explicit conclusion, right? You're saying, I'm using this as a basis for this, but really there's an implicit goal, and that's not implicit in the premise, it's implicit in the argument as a whole. Is that we spoke a lot about implicit premise. We're saying we're saying A supports B, and really we're also supposing, oh, A and A prime and whatever other preconditions for B. So that's kind of at the level of A, like, it is at the level of the arguments often, but sometimes it's at the level of A, like what makes A true. There's all these other co-conditions, but there's also, I'm doing A supports B to prove C. Then there's all these other, the implicit C is really, it's not about A, it's about the A supports B, it's about the thing as a whole. Well, maybe they're both about the thing as a whole. But I think that the presupposition are closer to the premise than the hidden goals. Still not being clear. It's not that important. I think we agreed that implicit is contextual. But yeah, there's really two directions of implicit, more premises and more conclusions. And I think I mostly have focused on the first case, not as much on the second.
I have my heart stopped now.
No, I think it's cool. What I'm getting out of this is importance of partial, mixed, hybrid partial formalization. That's something I will think about hard because I totally see the point of it. But I do think that my basic schema of it's all about, not all, but a lot of it is about saying, do these classes correspond? Are they included? Are there exceptions? Blah, 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 blah. I think it covers a ridiculously large number of cases. Pattern matching as a fundamental human thought activity. Matching a pattern with not a pattern, that is mostly, not just individuals. I'll keep thinking along those lines.
All right.
As well.
See you on Monday then.
Yep.
Monday?
Have a good weekend, everybody.
Isn't it Mondays? Or was it Tuesdays? I keep forgetting.
It's Tuesday.
Tuesday.
It's Tuesday.
So
Tuesday.
see you on Tuesday then.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye, have a good weekend.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.